Hello, I'm Africa 54 Managing Editor Vincent Makori in for Hashtag the U-Word. It's Tuesday, October the 19th. This is Africa 54.
Ethiopian families describe brutality and hunger as conflict spreads in the Amhara region. Local elections in South Africa test loyalties for the party of Nelson Mandela. And grim findings about tuberculosis deaths are revealed in a new World Health Organization report.
We begin in East Africa, where witnesses in Ethiopia's Tigray region say at least 2 people were killed and several others were injured in 2 airstrikes Monday, carried out by government forces on the regional capital, Mekelle. Residents who spoke to VOA say the airstrikes hit 2 areas, the Endarta district in the morning and the Adihaki district later in the day. The Ethiopian government initially denied launching the attacks, but the state-run Ethiopian press agency later acknowledged the airstrikes and say they targeted communication infrastructure. The Ethiopian federal government has been engaged in an armed conflict with fighters from the northern Tigray region for nearly a year. Stefan Dujarric, a spokesperson for the United Nations Secretary General, says Antonio Guterres is very concerned over the escalation of the Tigray conflict.
But we are deeply concerned about the potential impact on civilians who reside or work in the affected areas. The Secretary General is deeply concerned over the escalation of the conflict in northern Ethiopia, as illustrated by the airstrikes in Mekelle today. He underlines that all parties must avoid the targeting of civilians or civilian infrastructure. The Secretary General reiterates his call for all hostilities to stop. He urges the parties to prioritize the welfare of the people and to provide the necessary support for critical humanitarian assistance to flow, including facilitating the movement of fuel and medicines.
Mekelle has not seen large-scale fighting since June, when Ethiopian forces withdrew from the area and Tigray forces retook control of most of the region. Following that, the conflict continued to spill into the neighboring regions of Amhara and Afar. Tigray forces say last week the Ethiopian military launched a ground offensive to push them out of Amhara. Now, 3-year-old Saba died last month from malnutrition in Ethiopia's Amhara region. Spillover fighting in Amhara has forced thousands to flee their homes, carrying with them stories of hunger and brutality. David Doyle has more.
Saba was just 3 years old when she died of malnutrition. That was last month, as her mother tried to flee violence that has spread from Ethiopia's Tigray into neighboring Amhara. Pictures on her phone are all Ethiopia Makori has left of her daughter, having pleaded with doctors to save her child.
They told me she was severely affected by malnutrition and they could not help. Then they gave me some syrup and tablets. She passed away exactly a week later, on a Sunday.
Saba is just one victim of the hunger and violence that has swept through northern Ethiopia since war broke out between the federal military and forces loyal to the Tigray People's Liberation Front nearly a year ago. In July, having taken back much of Tigray, the TPLF pushed into Amhara, whose forces have been fighting alongside federal troops. The Tigrayan advance sent around 250,000 people fleeing their homes, the United Nations says. Habtam is among thousands who arrived in the town of Dessie, escaping bloodshed further north. She says there was little food in areas under Tigrayan control and that Tigrayan forces took scarce medicine from local pharmacies. Getachew Reda, spokesperson for the TPLF, denied Tigrayan forces had looted local pharmacies. He said they'd set up a generator to alleviate water shortages in Habtam's area. Reuters was not able to independently verify Habtam's account, as her home is in an area off limits to journalists and phone connections are down. But people don't just have hunger to fear. At a camp in Dessie, Sada says she was raped. The attack was carried out at her home by an armed man in plain clothes speaking the Tigrayan language, she says, in an area under Tigrayan control.
After, he yelled at me, "Get dressed now." I was so afraid at this point that I was going to lose my life and quickly said okay. Then, he grabbed his gun and left my house as I was getting dressed.
She provided as evidence a card showing she had visited a hospital in Dessie for treatment. When asked about the rape, the TPLF's Getachew said any reported incident would be investigated and that the actions of one man should not implicate the Tigrayan forces in general. Both sides in the conflict have accused the other of committing atrocities, and each side denies allegations against them. The TPLF says the Ethiopian military recently launched an offensive to dislodge the Tigrayans from Amhara. The military and government have not answered calls seeking information, but diplomats are worried the renewed fighting will further destabilize Ethiopia, and for Tigray and its surrounding areas, deepen the crisis of hunger and violence.
David Doyle of Reuters filed that report. A boat carrying 80 African migrants was rescued on Monday after it malfunctioned off the coast of the Libyan city Garabulli, according to a Coast Guard official. The migrants, including women and children, were from Mali, Gambia, Sudan, Nigeria, and other nationalities. Libya is home to nearly 600,000 migrants, according to the United Nations. Most are from sub-Saharan Africa. Some are attracted by the prospect of work in the oil-rich country, despite years of conflict and chaos, while others see it as a jumping-off point for travel to Europe. A floundering economy, in-party fighting and ceaseless corruption allegations are plaguing South Africa's ruling African National Congress. The November 1st local elections are likely to test whether loyalties to the party that brought an end to apartheid will prevail or shift in favor of a new political order. Linda Givertesh explained from Johannesburg.
In this neighborhood of Kliptown, Soweto, the late Nelson Mandela and others laid the foundation for the country's democracy. Now, nearly 30 years since the end of the apartheid, the public housing that provided Mandela's followers shelter are crumbling. As residents prepare to head to the ballot box, they say they're weighing the legacy of Mandela's ruling African National Congress. Some are venting frustration.
They're doing nothing for us, absolutely nothing. As you can see, how this place looks, as you can see. They're doing nothing, absolutely nothing for us. I'm very angry. Even if I see those people still campaigning, I think for myself, why must we still go vote? Why must we go vote? Because nothing been done for our place here.
South Africa's municipalities are in crisis, with many local governments insolvent and unable to deliver basic services like water and sanitation. Years of disappointment may lead people to not vote at all. For those who do turn out, there's no obvious favorite among the more than 300 parties and independent candidates.
This is a very difficult election to call, probably the most difficult election to call since '94 in South Africa. The levels of mismanagement and corruption are staggering. And this is mostly something that can be put in front of the ANC. And that is why the levels of dissatisfaction, the levels of disillusionment are staggering.
The past year has brought the country's challenges to a peak. A national inquiry into graft under former President Jacob Zuma revealed testimony of rigged tenders and kickbacks, which cost the public millions of dollars. Meanwhile, economically stifling lockdowns saw the unemployment rate soar to 34%. This scenario gives confidence to new opposition parties.
COVID-19, as bad as it was, it actually exposed the deep-rooted criminality of ANC. It exposed the deep-rooted corruption element of the ANC. So people are wide awake. We're going to mobilize South Africans, use our democratic right of voting them out to ensure that we can have a prosperous South Africa.
But lifelong party members who attribute their freedom and right to vote to the ANC remain loyal.
I can say let's give them a chance, ma'am. Like, one more chance. They will put this on through. They have to put people first now than themselves. If they can do that, this country will go forward without any hassle and hesitation.
On November 1st, South African voters will show whether they believe the ANC can still bring reform or whether it's time to give the opposition a chance to bring positive change. Linda Giftash for VOA News, Johannesburg.
Colin Powell, the first black U.S. Secretary of State and top military officer, died on Monday at the age of 84 from complications due to COVID-19. His family wrote in a statement on Facebook that he was fully vaccinated and that they had lost a remarkable and loving husband, father, grandfather, and a great American. VOA Pentagon correspondent Colin Powell shares more on Powell's legacy.
Colin Powell was a respected military general, statesman, and one of America's foremost black figures. He served as National Security Advisor under President Ronald Reagan, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff under President George H.W. Bush, and finally Secretary of State under President George W. Bush, the first African American to ever serve in the latter two leadership posts.
I was sitting in my office and one of the senior members of the staff came in and closed the door and said, "Sir, I have to ask you something." And a lot of confusion in the building. So what's wrong? He said, "Well, what do we call you? Do we call you General or Mr. Secretary?" And I said, "By all means, it's Mr. Secretary. Now drop and give me 10.
The passing of Colin Powell is the end of an era. He personified the great excellence and achievement of African Americans in our nation's armed forces, in some ways perhaps even paving the way for the Obama presidency.
In 1996, Powell considered a bid to become the first black president, but his wife discouraged him out of fear of potential assassination attempts from extremists. When Democrat Barack Obama made the bid years later, the moderate Republican broke with his party to endorse Obama. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, the first black U.S. Defense Secretary, called Powell a tremendous mentor and friend.
He always made time for me, and I could always go to him with tough issues. He always had great counsel. We will certainly miss him. I feel as if I have a hole in my heart.
Wounded twice as a young soldier in Vietnam, the war shaped his views of when and how presidents should and should not use armed forces.
And I believe Secretary Powell's years as a soldier are what made him such an exceptional diplomat. He knew that war and military action should always be a last resort.
Powell received high praise for his overwhelming use of force in the Gulf War, which quickly pushed Iraqi forces out of Kuwait in 1991. But critics have denounced his controversial presentation to the UN Security Council in February 2003. Powell made the case for the invasion of Iraq during the George W. Bush administration, citing Iraqi weapons of mass destruction that were never found.
The facts in Iraq's behavior demonstrate that Saddam Hussein and his regime have made no effort to disarm as required by the international community.
That's probably the major blemish on his record, but it really wasn't only his blemish, it was the whole intelligence community. I think there are 13 different intelligence agencies, and 12 out of 13 said Iraq has weapons of mass destruction, and he studied and then he came to agree. They were all wrong.
Even Powell later called the presentation a, quote, blot in his career. Today, Republicans and Democrats alike uphold him as a man of honor and a patriot to the end. Carla Babb, VOA News, the Pentagon.
Colin Powell will be remembered in Sudan, South Sudan, and other African countries for peacemaking and sounding the alarm against war abuses. Cameron Hudson, a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Africa Center and former White House Director of Africa, says Powell will be remembered for being the first U.S. official to declare genocide in Darfur and for his involvement in the comprehensive peace agreement that ended Sudan's longest-running civil war, which paved the way for the independence of South Sudan. For more on how General Powell will be remembered for his role in shaping some of the U.S. policies toward Africa, we turn to Scott Stearns, VOA's acting Africa Division Director and former VOA White House correspondent during the George W. Bush administration. Scott, welcome to Africa 54.
Thanks.
Let's start with the Sudan Darfur issue. Why was that significant? His declaration, Colin Powell's declaration, that a genocide was taking place.
So there was much attention to Secretary Powell's testimony before Congress in 2004. Would he call it a genocide or not? Because no sitting administration official had ever used the word genocide about a conflict that was going on at that time. Congress had determined sometime earlier that, in their opinion, it was genocide. But the question for the Bush administration was, would they use that word? He did use that word, in part because members of the Bush administration were mindful of what had happened during the Clinton administration regarding Rwanda. As it turned out, Secretary Powell's decision to use that word, it did not force the Bush administration into any action in Darfur. The hope was that it might mobilize the international community to take some action in Darfur or to pressure the government in Khartoum to reverse its course. That didn't really happen either. I guess the notable achievement of calling it genocide was to give encouragement to the Save Darfur movement domestically in the United States at that time.
Which actually became very, very active. We could see it on the streets of Washington, too. But then General Powell was also Secretary of State at the time when terrorists, and particularly Al-Qaeda, were really trying to infiltrate African countries to use them as, grounds for plotting attacks in the U.S. and elsewhere. What role did he play to stave off that influence of Al-Qaeda?
One of the reasons that Secretary Powell initially resisted the push into Iraq after the invasion of Afghanistan following 9/11 was to keep focused on Al-Qaeda, responsible for 9/11, responsible for the embassy's bombings in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam. That was where he wanted to keep the focus. As we saw in the obit from Carla Babb, he did eventually come around to supporting that war, which I think history will judge did diffuse U.S. attention and distracted from Afghanistan and distracted from pursuing Al-Qaeda with the force that U.S. troops might have had they not also been involved in Iraq.
Yes. And one other thing that happened during Colin Powell's tenure is the initiative that was launched by President George W. Bush, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, PEPFAR. Now, did he play a role in helping that succeed? Because actually it happened, sometime in the middle of the first term.
Certainly. Colin Powell, Condoleezza Rice, President Bush himself, and Anthony Fauci, who we have now seen in this COVID crisis, were instrumental to the beginning of PEPFAR, the global fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria, and many of the other really early Bush administration engagements with Africa Millennium Challenge Corporation, expanding AGOA. These are things that, it's not unusual in this country or in others, even if you're in the same party, sometimes you do away with things that the last guy did, even if it was good, because you want to put your own name on it. I think the value of PEPFAR, a Millennium Challenge, and AGOA, and all of those things from early Bush is that it survived the Obama administration, it survived the Donald Trump administration, and those continue to be the levers that the United States uses to help Africans even under this current administration.
Well, thank you very much for helping us. Really appreciate how Colin Powell will be remembered by our African audiences. Scott Stearns is VOA Africa Division Director, acting VOA Acting Director of Africa Division, and is a former White House correspondent during the George W. Bush administration. And still to come on Africa 54, an international development charity is giving Zimbabwean citizens a sweet new option to survive. But first, Haiti Adams tells us what's coming up on Wednesday's Straight Talk Africa.
On the next Straight Talk Africa, we're going to look at the Me Too effect on Africa's women.
Sisterhood! Sisterhood! Hear my voice! Hear my voice!
In recent years, the movement against sexual abuse and harassment has helped bring high-profile figures in Hollywood and global politics to book.
To be a woman is not a crime! To be a woman is not a crime!
But how global and inclusive is the Me Too movement? Is it helping or hurting the fight for women's rights and safety in African countries? We'll also look at the role and space for men in the conversation. So be sure to join me, Heidi Adams, on the next Straight Talk Africa.
The worldwide death toll from tuberculosis is increasing for the first time in more than a decade, primarily due to the COVID-19 pandemic. This is just one of the findings from the latest World Health Organization Global TB report. Africa 54 health correspondent Lino Mudu has more.
The 2021 Global Tuberculosis Report reveals that the COVID-19 pandemic has put a dent on the fight against tuberculosis. The World Health Organization's report says the pandemic has reversed years of global progress in tackling TB, as focus was put on the COVID-19 response. Dr. Teresa Kasaeva is the director of the Global TB Program with the World Health Organization.
We are very pleased that it became possible, even during COVID-19 pandemic, provide this important reporting on the TB notification, which allows us to inform the decision makers, TB community, stakeholders and funders about the gaps in TB care and how to fill these gaps and increase investments in TB response.
Dr. Kasaeva says in 2020, more people died from TB and less people were diagnosed, treated, or provided with TB preventive treatment compared with 2019.
For the first time over the past decade, we can see growth in TB death. 1.5 million people died from TB last year, including more than 200,000 people with HIV.
The increase in the number of TB deaths occurred mainly in the 30 countries with the highest burden of TB. Among them are Angola, Brazil, Pakistan, Liberia, and South Africa. The reasons include the disruption in access to tuberculosis services, a reduction in resources, and people's difficulties to seek care during lockdowns. WHO estimates that about 4.1 million people currently suffer from TB, but have not been diagnosed or registered, compared to 2.9 million in 2019. In addition,
we see that only 1 in each 3 people with drug-resistant TB received TB treatment. And we know that this category has more severe impact due to TB and poorer treatment outcomes. Unfortunately, again, we can see drops in compare with the previous year by 21% in provision of TB preventive treatment.
The 2021 Global TB Report calls for urgent measures by countries to restore access to essential TB services, increase investments in TB research and innovation, as well as a holistic approach to address the social, environmental, and economic determinants of tuberculosis and its consequences. Linor Mudu, VOA News, Washington.
Burundi has finally rolled out its first COVID-19 vaccines months after most African countries. Monday's action in the East African nation is a shift towards a more active approach to containing the pandemic. The vaccination campaign started in Bujumbura, where dozens of residents lined up at a special vaccination site, telling Reuters that they heard about the vaccination drive through word of mouth. No government officials were present to inaugurate the launch, and the health ministry did not respond to requests for comment. President Evariste Ndayishimiye, who took office in June 2020 after former President Pierre Nkurunziza's death, is promising a more proactive approach in combating the virus. Eritrea is now the only African country that has not started a vaccination program. After Cyclone Idai hit in 2019, some Zimbabweans turned to activities like illegal gold panning to survive. Now, an international development charity is giving citizens a new option, beekeeping. As Columbus Mavunga reports from the town of Chimanimani, life has turned sweet for one Zimbabwean because of the honey from his bees.
While some in Chimanimani started gold panning after surviving Cyclone Idai in 2019, 21-year-old Washington Nyakaze turned to beekeeping after he and his family survived the disaster. He has no regrets as he gets at least $300 a month from organic honey sales.
Since I started beekeeping, I've seen a change in my life. Money is now coming to our home through honey sales. At times, I even wonder if it's me having some of the amount of money I get some days.
Their fields were left in tatters after cyclone struck, leaving millions in Malawi, Mozambique and Zimbabwe homeless and hungry. Voluntary service overseas Zimbabwe is training villagers, mainly youth, to do beekeeping here in Chimanimani.
Due to climate change, unpredictable droughts and persistent flooding after Cyclone Idai, we've managed to realize that beekeeping is a viable adaptation strategy. So we've trained young people in beekeeping so that they can also earn some income as a secure and resilient livelihood option.
Roslyn Mukonowe Shuro now works for a local NGO, but used to work for the government-owned Zimbabwe Forestry Commission. She says beekeeping is advantageous to the environment.
Beekeeping is very important because we see that once people are practicing beekeeping, they will protect their forests. And as a result, they won't cut the trees because they need the trees for forage. And at the same time, they won't burn the forest because they still need to have their hives as well as the forage.
According to the Forestry Commission, Zimbabwe loses 330,000 hectares of forest annually as a result of deforestation. But Nyakaze is jealously guarding all the trees near his home. He plans on increasing his 50 beehives to more than 100 next year and wants to start exporting his organic honey to Europe and the United States. Columbus Mavunga for VOA News, Chimanimani, Zimbabwe.
And that's our show for today. Be sure to watch Africa 54 on our website at voaafrica.com. From all of us in Washington, thanks for watching.